Hello, everyone. Ahead of the lecture next week, I wanted to get some basic information down about malingering and response styles. So what I'm going to hopefully do today is just cover some basic terminology, basic concepts, and then when we get to class, we'll spend some time on how to actually assess malingering and feigning and response bias in a forensic evaluation. So before we begin, I think it's important to just consider for a second why this is relevant. It's relevant because in a forensic assessment, the person being evaluated has always a distinct possibility of misrepresenting themselves. They will certainly have a motivation to misrepresent themselves. So if you think about a criminal defendant who's going through a trial process, if they can convince the psychologist or psychiatrist that they have a serious mental illness when they don't, or if they have a mental illness that it's much worse than it actually is, they might be able to escape persecution through the prosecution process. They may be able to be found incompetent. They may be found to be insane at the time. They might be able to offer that information to mitigate their sentence should they be found guilty. If we're talking about a disability claim, then I think it becomes very obvious why the person has this motivation to make their emotional or psychological or psychiatric symptoms seem worse than they actually are. So it's relevant and it's important to assess in every forensic evaluation. So what is malingering? Well, malingering is a diagnostic classification that can be found in the DSM. Now notice I said diagnostic classification is not an actual diagnosis. There's no disorder called malingering. Malingering, in fact, is when the person is intentionally exaggerating their psychological or physical symptoms. They're either making them up, making them worse than they actually are, and it has to be motivated by external incentives. So there has to be something externally motivating them, and we've already talked in the last slide about some of those possible motivations. In a criminal setting, it may be to be found not competent to proceed. In a disability or civil forensic setting, it may be a personal injury lawsuit or a disability claim. The important thing is that we're talking about the person intentionally producing these symptoms that aren't real or exaggerating symptoms that they in fact do have of a physical, psychological, and even though the DSM doesn't mention it, we can also add neurocognitive or neurological problems as well. Now, the field uses a number of terms. Malingering is the diagnostic term. It's what we would actually put in a report if we wanted to alert the court or another mental health provider that this person is in fact malingering. But oftentimes we're going to use other terms in the field, terms like dissimulation or response bias, which is where we're basically saying that the person is inaccurately portraying their psychological, physical, or neurological, neurocognitive symptoms, but we're not necessarily noting the intent or the motivation behind this misrepresentation. This can take the form of over-reporting, making themselves look worse than they actually are. So we refer to this sometimes as feigning a mental illness, or more generically, we may refer to it as faking bad. And then the other side, the flip side of that, is underreporting. So where the person is portraying themselves as more adjusted, better adjusted, having less or fewer problems than they may actually have. And so we might refer to this as defensive or guarded responding. And we see this a lot in forensic settings, but particular forensic settings. So for example, if a person's being evaluated for child custody or a parental fitness evaluation, and they want to portray themselves as having fewer problems, then this might be their approach. We also see this in the criminal domain when someone is being evaluated for a violence risk or sex offender risk assessment, and they want to portray themselves as less impaired by problems or symptoms. So why do people misrepresent themselves, minimize, distort, alter, feign their presentations? Well, we've already talked about these external influences. So The fact that they're involved in litigation or they're involved in a case, that puts a lot of demand on a person, and that demand can push them to over-report, under-report, misrepresent, mischaracterize their symptoms. Sometimes they get actually pushed by other people. So their attorneys may push them to, really play up their symptoms, make sure this doctor is convinced that you have this problem. And certainly family members who might benefit from a successful portrayal of them having these sorts of issues. Internally, people dissimulate or feign their responses for a variety of reasons. So it may be that they feel that their credibility has been questioned, and so they want to really overdo it so that you as the professional take them seriously. In some cases, the stigmatization of mental illness or disability status is such that they may want to minimize those problems. In other ways, the effects of the actual disorders or disability status itself may cause them to misrepresent, what's going on. And then, sometimes people are motivated internally to obtain benefits, whether it's playing the sick role and having people kind of take care of them or look after them. These can be very powerful motivators for how a person describes their symptoms. And keep in mind, when we're talking about a psychological assessment, most of what we're talking about is based on self-report. The person is reporting how they're feeling, and therefore they can misrepresent that in that report. They can misrepresent how they're doing. So your goal as a forensic psychologist is to make sense of how they're presenting, how the defendant or plaintiff is coming across in the evaluation, keeping in mind the context of the examination. So, what are those factors that might be driving their presentation? We want to look at those issues that are the core issues in the evaluation. So in a competency evaluation, what we're looking at is whether or not they're competent to stand trial. And so we want to look at what is required in terms of the defendant's ability to go through a trial, and how might mental illness hamper those abilities or limit those abilities. And then we want to see, is their presentation with respect to mental illness a credible one, or one that has some evidence of response bias or possibly malingering. There are a lot of misconceptions about malingering. There's variable kind of thoughts about how rare or how common it is, or that it even occurs at some predictable rate. Keep in mind, rates don't really matter in terms of the actual case that's in front of you. So whether or not malingering occurs at a 30 or 40% base rate in criminal evaluations, that really doesn't inform what the person in front of you is doing. So you still have to pay attention to what it is. Another kind of concept to keep in mind is that a person's going to be malingering the entire time. They may not. They may overdo it on a psychological test, but not corroborate that during a clinical interview. They may turn it on and turn it off at different points during the evaluation. It's not that if someone's malingering, they're going to be malingering the entire time. They may not be. The DSM says that if a person has antisocial personality disorder, that's somehow evidence of malingering. And I would argue against this. The research is really not supportive of this part of the DSM conception of malingering. In fact, there have been a number of studies that have shown that people with and without antisocial personality disorder show any real distinct differences with respect to their ability to malinger or their rate of malingering. It's certainly a misconception to think of it as inconsequential. Malingering can have a really important influence on the evaluation. If a person's malingering symptoms in a competency evaluation, the psychologist or psychiatrist evaluating that person may have a really difficult time establishing that they have a mental illness or mental condition, which is a prerequisite aspect of being found incompetent. Another thought to keep in mind is this concept of deception. Is lying malingering? I would argue malingering and lying are two different things. They're somewhat related, but they're not exactly the same. So evidence of deception in an evaluation doesn't necessarily mean that the person's malingering symptoms of a mental disorder. As I noted before, the DSM doesn't diagnose malingering, it classifies it. There are no criteria that have to be met for malingering like you would see with respect to depression or an anxiety disorder or schizophrenia. The DSM really doesn't provide an effective means for understanding this concept, and we'll talk more about this in class. Probably the biggest thing that you have to understand about malingering is that it's not mutually exclusive with mental illness. People can absolutely have mental illness and still malinger. And in fact, in some ways, having a history of mental illness might actually make you better at malingering because you understand what it's like to have that illness. And finally, this idea that it's a pejorative term. In some contexts, it absolutely is. To be thought of as malingering can be thought of as a faker, a liar, someone who's being deceptive. But we can also just be descriptive about it. And if there's evidence of it, there's evidence of it. And we can point that out in our evaluations. So what actually can be feigned? Well, everything, in essence. Certainly mental illness can be feigned. We can think about mood, psychotic symptoms, anxiety symptoms, extreme anxiety, that can certainly be malingered. Intellectual disability can be malingered. There's cases where people have, parents have tried to portray their children as having intellectual disabilities when in fact they don't, so they can be labeled as disabled and earn money for that. Amnesia, big one that can be malingered. So people commit crimes and then they claim to have no memory of them. Attention, big issue, certainly in colleges where more and more students are trying to get accommodations for ADHD and learning disabilities, either because they want accommodations or because they want medications that have a higher prescription abuse potential with them. Medical issues, somatic issues absolutely can be malingered. And then incompetency evaluations, people can feign a lack of legal knowledge. They can basically act like they don't understand what a defense attorney does, a prosecutor does, what a judge does, as a means to portray themselves as incompetent. I want to just end with a couple notes about how we research this topic. There are two major approaches. So once a malingering measure, an assessment tool has been developed to assess response bias or malingering, we have to research it to see if it works. And there are two main research methodologies. I just want to touch on them before we end. So the first is called a simulation or analog design. And it's a pretty basic and easy design to understand. Essentially what you're doing is comparing two groups of people on a particular test. Now, what you do is you have an experimental group that you instruct to feign or complete under a certain context. So you may say, act like you have PTSD while completing the following test, or act like you have schizophrenia, or fake bad. And that group is compared to a group who's supposed to complete the test under kind of genuine or honest instruction. So complete the test honestly. Now this is a pretty strong design because of the internal validity, where you know that this group of people are in the faking group and the other people are in the non-faking group or genuine group. The problem, though, is that it lacks generalizability. It lacks what's called ecological validity, because really the person in either of these groups, it doesn't have the same motivation to accurately portray a mental illness like they would if they were actually being evaluated for their case. There are ways to make this better. You can compare a faking group, not with unimpaired healthy people, but try to get a clinical comparison group. So if you're looking at a measure to see how well does it detect feigned PTSD, You might instruct a group of students or participants to take this test, act like you have PTSD, fake the symptoms, and then compare them to a group of veterans, let's say, who we know have PTSD. So now we're seeing, does this scale or test or measure differentiate faking, protocols versus people with the actual condition? You can also try to give very clear instruction. So the older kind of, earlier generation studies in this regard basically just said, take this test and fake bad. Make yourself look worse than you actually are. And inevitably what people would do is they would just endorse a lot of psychotic symptoms and really make themselves appear crazy. Now we're getting a little bit more sophisticated where people are providing some background on the conditions that they want to fake, and seeing, even with some degree of coaching, can the test still work? And then finally, we're seeing now pretty standard post-test questionnaire. So we want to know, did the person in the faking group actually follow the instructions? Could they tell you afterwards what they were supposed to do? So those post-test questionnaires can be helpful. And then finally, this is compared to what's called a criterion groups or known groups approach. And in this approach, we have more external validity, more generalizability, because we're looking at people who are actually being evaluated for a forensic case. What you're doing here is you're using some criterion measure, like a malingering scale, to differentiate a group of people being evaluated. And you're seeing whether a different measure that they were also administered can differentiate between these groups. So this can be kind of neat because you're actually looking at people who have that motivation to fake while they're being evaluated. The problem, though, is that not every measure is perfect. So when you're setting up these groups, this is our faking group, this is our non-faking group, you may miss some people. You may misclassify people because the measure you're using isn't necessarily perfect. In order to make this a strong design, you really want to pick a good criterion measure, and in some cases you might use multiple criteria. So people faking on multiple tests versus just one. And so you've set up these two groups. This is the group that tends to fake, or that has been identified as faking, versus the group that's not. And then you're comparing them on the other measure. So you really do look at people who have that skin in the game in terms of how they're portraying themselves. Well, thank you for listening. And in class, we'll talk more about how we specifically evaluate malingering. Thank you.